Hey, Congressman.
How are you?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll jump right into it. So thank you for joining me and coming on this alternative media platform. I'm a live streamer. My name's Guy. I go by I'm Really Important. But I live stream on Twitch and YouTube where we talk politics. So it's real exciting for us to have a member of Congress come on here. So thank you very much.
I'm going to be here.
Awesome. So I want to talk about President Biden's approach to what's going on in Israel. And I wonder, what are your general thoughts on how the U.S. has responded to the conflict over there?
I generally approve of President Biden's handling. He's the first president to go to Israel in a time of war. He sent not one but two carriers to the Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah from starting a war with Israel. And, he's been supportive of Israel under extraordinarily challenging circumstances at the cost of facing a backlash from the far left of the party. So I feel like he's been fundamentally a friend to Israel. But at the same time, he's rightfully been advocating for aid, humanitarian aid to Palestinians in distress. And so I feel like the president has taken a balanced approach.
And do you think that this conflict is going to have an impact on the November elections?
It's hard to know for sure. The election is a lifetime away. There are obviously Jewish voters who care deeply about Israel, and there's a strong Jewish vote both in Michigan and in Pennsylvania, which are swing states. And there's obviously an Arab and Palestinian and Muslim vote that cares deeply about the issue and is primarily in Michigan. But the majority of voters are not going to vote on foreign policy. I mean, most people are going to vote on bread and butter issues, the economy. So if you ask me which issue starting with I is going to be the most decisive in the election, it's not Israel, it's inflation and immigration.
Yeah, it does seem like domestic issues will take the lead when it comes to how people come out and vote, especially with abortion and like you said, inflation and such. Please go ahead.
The sense that Donald Trump poses an existential threat to our democracy. You might recall in 2022, the media was predicting a red wave, and what was widely thought to be a red wave became nothing more than a trickle, because the voters rejected Trumpism and were appalled by the overturning of Roe versus Wade. January 6th and the frontal assault on reproductive rights has provoked a backlash from the American electorate, particularly the female vote.
For sure. Did you see that coming? A lot of people seem to be caught off guard by how terrible the Republicans did in the midterms.
Honestly, no one saw it coming, but it reveals the power of the woman's vote. And, we've seen since the reversal of Roe versus Wade, in the Arizona Supreme Court just revived an almost total ban on abortion. The Alabama Supreme Court made a decision that had the effect of effectively criminalizing in vitro fertilization. And so Roe versus Wade has opened the floodgates to an unprecedented assault on the reproductive rights of women.
Yep, for sure. I think they're going to make their voices heard here in about 6 months, too. I have family from southern Israel, so I just wanted to say briefly, I really appreciate how vocal you've been in your defense of Israel. Is that a role that you take on? Are you happy to take on that role as like a public face who's so out there defending Israel so vocally, I guess? It seems like it comes with a lot of grief, too.
I mean, I wish we lived in a world with no anti-Semitism so that there was no need for me to take on the role. It's a painful position. There's no issue on which I face more hate, harassment, and death threats than on the subject of Israel. I've been the target of homophobic and racist invective. You might have seen Bella and Gigi Hadid's father attack me with racist comments. He said that I'm worse than the rats of the New York City sewage system. He said that I should wear a KKK mask to cover that ugly gray-colored face of mine.
Wow.
And so when you're a person of color and you're pro-Israel, you become fair game for racist invective.
Yeah, seems to bring out the worst in people. I want to shift a little bit to these campus protests and just get your general thoughts on them. What do you think about this whole campus protest movement?
I celebrate protest in general. Like, I celebrate free expression. There's nothing wrong with protest. There's nothing wrong with criticism of a government, including the Israeli government. And if there were a protest about advocating for a two-state solution, or advocating for humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, or even advocating for an end to the war, I would have no objections. But it is clear to me that the purpose of these protests is to advocate for the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And that, to me, is not constructive criticism. That is extremism, right? The organizations behind the encampment movement, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Within Our Lifetime, openly call for the destruction of Israel. These organizations openly celebrate October 7th, glorify the terrorism of Hamas as quote unquote resistance. And so if you are an organization that seeks the violent destruction of Israel as a Jewish state, you're not a pro-peace, anti-war protest. You're an anti-peace, pro-war protest. And that, to me, is unacceptable.
You represent a district that's pretty close to Columbia. Have you ever thought about going down there and seeing it for yourself?
So I've been to Columbia. I have not seen the encampment movement firsthand, but I've met with Jewish students at Columbia Law School and at the Columbia Chabad. So I've been monitoring the situation at Columbia long before the latest outbreak of anti-Semitism.
Gotcha. And I guess what do you think is causing this sort of extreme expression? I feel like there's outside groups that might be involved, and I'm curious if I'm being a bit ridiculous when I assume that. We see a lot of people arrested that aren't students at these schools in these protests, but do you feel that there's some astroturfing going on, perhaps from people that like to see this sort of chaos within the Democratic Party, or even foreign actors who want to see problems within the United States?
Look, there is a concerted effort by the BDS movement, by organizations like Within Our Lifetime and Students for Justice in Palestine, to indoctrinate the next generation of Americans with a hatred for Israel that's so visceral and so fanatical that it renders them indifferent to the value of Jewish life. What we are seeing on college campuses is not an accident. It is the consequence, the culmination of a long process of systematically dehumanizing and demonizing the Jewish state, right? The stereotypes and anti-Semitic tropes that have historically been directed against the Jewish community are increasingly being redirected against the Jewish state, right? The Jewish state, Israel, has become something of a blank slate on which to project anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it seems like there's this new catch-all phrase, Zionist, and everything's on the table when it comes to Zionists. Even though if you were to ask somebody, what is a Zionist? 95% of Jews identify as a Zionist.
It's a powerful point. The substitution of the word Zionist for Jew is the modus operandi of the new anti-Semitism, right? If someone said Jews control the world, everyone agrees that's anti-Semitic.
Right.
But if the same person were to say Zionists control the world, then all of a sudden it becomes socially acceptable, even though the underlying message is the same, even though most Jews identify as pro-Israel, identify as Zionist. There was a lead organizer in Colombia, in the Colombia encampment movement, who was caught on video saying that Zionists do not deserve to live. And he said that Zionists should be grateful to him for not going out there and murdering him. If that is not evidence of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, then I'm not sure what would be.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question. I mean, if I was a Jewish student on campus, I wouldn't feel safe with that guy going around. And it's Columbia, as far as I know, they just barred him from campus, whatever that means. So what do you think needs to be done to make the campus feel safe for everybody?
We need our colleges and universities to fight anti-Semitism with the same sense of urgency that these institutions fight every other form of bigotry. Right? If there were a protester who said to an Asian student, "Go back to Asia," or to a Black student, "Go back to Africa," or to a Latin student, "Go back to Latin America," everyone would agree that's bigotry. So it should not be acceptable to tell a Jewish student to go back to Europe. Never mind that the majority of Jews in Israel are not from Europe, are Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, but facts no longer matter in our society.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't feel like people are really differentiating much between Zionist and Jew. And then they also have a couple Jewish people they found who don't like Israel for whatever reason. And they're like, well, look, we've got these guys, so clearly we've got the support of the Jewish community. I think it's ridiculous. You've introduced this bill.
Although I will say those same people,
sure,
if would never say that Black Republicans is evidence that there's no racism in the Republican Party. Like, right. It's a double standard. And yep. Notice if the KKK or neo-Nazis had established an encampment at Columbia University, no one would be arguing that that is an exercise of free speech. Everyone would be calling for the end of the encampment. And so I find that the invocation of the First Amendment is often selective, and there's an attempt to weaponize the First Amendment as a pretext for turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. And we have to be careful not to be fooled by that trick.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And you've introduced this bill, the Columbia Act, that would have third-party monitors to see if universities like Columbia are addressing anti-Semitism. Can you talk about that bill a little bit? And I'm also really curious about your bringing Mike Lawler along, a Republican, and if that was super important for you to have a Republican on board as well, so publicly.
Well, we in Congress have to send a message that the fight against anti-Semitism is so critical that it should transcend partisanship. It's neither Democratic nor Republican. It is the right thing to do to be in the fight against anti-Semitism. As you might know, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination and intimidation based on race, religion, and national origin. It prohibits the creation of a hostile environment for Jews on college campus. The problem is that there's been a lack of Title VI enforcement. Right? The problem is not a lack of legislation, it is a lack of enforcement. And so I'm introducing legislation that would enhance Title VI enforcement, that would empower the Federal Department of Education to impose a monitor, a third-party monitor, not on every college and university, but only when there is reason to suspect a civil rights violation. I'm skeptical that the Federal Department of Education can effectively enforce the law from the ivory tower of Washington, D.C. There's a real need to have a monitor who is on site, who sees the facts on the ground with his own eyes, and who can report whether a university is protecting the safety of their Jewish students. And if a university refuses to take the action that is necessary to ensure the safety of Jewish students, then the institution should be at risk of losing federal funding. That's how you drive change.
And how did you connect with Mike Lawler on this? Obviously, he's in the New York delegation with you, but there's a lot of Republicans out there.
Mike is a friend, and Mike has been particularly engaged in the fight against anti-Semitism. It's an issue that matters to him enormously, and so there's a natural partnership between him and me. I've been one of the most vocal Democrats. He's been one of the most vocal Republicans, and neither one of us is Jewish. We're both allies of the Jewish community.
Interesting.
We might be Jewish, but my running joke is that after the explosion of George Santos, I became the most prominent Jewish gay Latino congressman from New York. So that's my claim to fame.
I like it. Are there a lot of other Republicans that you work with? I try to emphasize bipartisanship because you're part of a legislative body, and from the outside, we see all these people fighting. You know, we hear from the loudest actors, but I'm willing to bet a lot of you guys get along. So are there any other Republicans that you work with on a regular basis, or people would be surprised to hear that you're friendly with?
I partnered with Mike Gallagher to address the concerns about TikTok. Mike Gallagher recently resigned, but I had a productive working relationship with him. And I partnered with the Financial Services Chair, Patrick McHenry, to craft a framework for regulating cryptocurrencies. I'm often reminded of a quote from Fiorello LaGuardia, who said that there's no Democratic or Republican way to take out the trash. That yes, there are going to be issues like guns, abortion, on which there are going to be fundamental differences of opinion between Democrats and Republicans. But there's a much wider universe of issues that lend themselves to bipartisan cooperation and compromise. And I feel like we all, Democrats and Republicans, have an obligation to partner for the good of the country. I'm an American first and foremost, and then I'm a Democrat.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I hope we see a lot more bipartisanship in the future because there's no way to get it done on our own. And we've got to work together. And I'm glad that people like yourself are leading. And I was just really impressed that you and Mike Lawler came out together, in these polarized times and showed bipartisanship. It's pretty rare. Let me shift subjects to mental health care. I know you're a big proponent of mental health care. You've been very open with your own journey. And I believe I've myself have had plenty of mental health care. It's improved my life tremendously. I think the return on investment of mental health care is huge. Why do you think there is still such a lack of investment in mental health care in this country?
Well, the issue of mental health care is often overlooked. It's central to my own journey. More than 15 years ago, I found myself at the lowest point in my life. I had dropped out of college because I was struggling with depression, abusing substances. There were moments when I thought of taking my own life because I felt as if the world around me had collapsed. And I even underwent hospitalization. And I never thought 7 years later, I would become the youngest elected official in America's largest city as a New York City council member. And then 7 years later, become a member of the United States Congress. And so I honestly believe that I would not be in Congress. I would not be alive today were it not for the power of mental health care and the stability that it gave me in my moment of greatest need. And I have made it my mission to share my story in order to break the silence and stigma and shame that often surrounds the subject of mental health. I want to send a clear message that mental health, that depression and anxiety, these are conditions of which we need not be ashamed, and that we should seek treatment, which can have a real impact in saving people's lives. As a congressman, I secured about $8 million to support the largest network of school-based health centers in the country, in the Bronx, so that students in Bronx high schools could have access to mental health care. When I was in high school struggling with depression, I had no vocabulary for what I was experiencing, and there were no on-site psychologists or psychiatrists or social workers. And so I often asked myself, if I had had access to those services when I was in high school, then maybe all the tragedies that followed would have been prevented.
Yeah, I can't help but imagine a lot of these problems we face, like gun violence and drug abuse, it's directly connected to mental health care. And we don't treat it seriously in this country. I hope we get to a point where people treat mental health care like going to the gym, it's that important in people's lives, because it's crazy for me to think that we can handle all this on our own. And I think people just get lucky and kind of figure things out. So,
and there's no set of people whom we are feeling more profoundly than the severely mentally ill.
Yeah.
Who are often left to languish on the streets, on subways, in jails and prisons. One of the largest providers of mental health care in the United States is Rikers Island, is the New York City jail system. That to me is an indictment of our society.
True. Yeah, that is horrific. I want to be respectful of your time, so I just want to hit a couple more quick subjects here. Housing, I know, is another issue that you are super passionate about. That seems to be a top issue right now, even going into the elections. I mean, it's a sticky point for inflation. I've seen some proposals for bringing down the cost of living for people owning homes, like restricting the number of houses landlords can have, or providing a credit, as Biden has advocated for recently, $10,000 a year for 2 years. What are some ideas that you have, since you're right in the heart of it when it comes to affordable housing? What are some solutions you think?
Well, at the heart of the affordability crisis is a gap between supply and demand. Right? The demand for housing far exceeds the supply. And so there's a real need to create enough housing to meet the demand. But there's also a need to ensure that the housing we create is affordable to the lowest income families, the poorest families in America. You know, one common criticism of affordable housing policy is that most of the affordable housing that we create tends to be unaffordable to the most vulnerable families, to the lowest income families. And so I believe in housing as a human right, and the best way to operationalize housing as a human right is a concept known as Section 8 for all, or housing vouchers for all. You know, imagine if every family struggling with homelessness or housing insecurity had access to a voucher, which guarantees that you pay no more than 30% of your income toward your rent, right? That would radically reduce the amount of homelessness and housing insecurity in America. Like, we should treat housing as a fundamental right for families and children, just like we treat education as a fundamental right for families with children.
Yeah, it's a great point. Why do we prioritize education so much? I mean, if you're sleeping in your car with your kids, it's going to be kind of hard for them to get an education, or if they don't have a full stomach while they're at school, but yet we prioritize getting them in there for some reason, probably to make sure people can go to their job and work. But yeah, how possible?
Yeah, I'm deeply shaped by Abraham Maslow's theory of self-actualization, right? Abraham Maslow holds that we have a hierarchy of needs, and the highest need is self-actualization. But in order to actualize ourselves, we need to meet our most basic needs, you know, shelter, food, water. And I would argue that among those needs is education and housing.
Yeah, for sure. Final subject then to chat with you. How optimistic are you about the November elections? I tell you, from the outside, it looks like the GOP is doing everything they can to lose these elections. I know you're going to say we got to fight, we got to stay vigilant, but do you see a lot of hope when so many people are down with like the poll numbers for Biden, which I think are ridiculous 6 months from the election? But I'm curious what your thoughts are on the upcoming elections.
I am cautiously optimistic about the House. Although keep in mind, the number of genuinely competitive seats is so vanishingly small that whoever controls the House will likely control it by a few seats. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seats in either direction. So I'm most optimistic about the House. I'm least optimistic about the Senate, and the presidency is somewhere in between. And so I'm anxious because the risk of Republican control of the federal government, complete Republican control, is much greater than people realize. And so we have to fight our heart out to ensure that we reelect President Biden and we retain either the House or the Senate or both, for the sake of LGBTQ equality, democracy, and reproductive liberty.
I like to ask this question of lawmakers like yourself. Do you have any personal interactions with Biden that you could share that aren't private, that kind of gives an example of who he is that we may not be aware of? Anything like that? I hate to put you on the spot, but just curious.
You know, I don't know the president well, but I've been in the Oval Office a few times, and you know, he's just an everyday person. He loves to tell stories. And he just loves to schmooze and interact with people. You know, I find it most moving when he speaks about his own tragedies in life. It's profoundly humanizing, and I feel like given his experience with his son, given his experience with losing a child and losing a spouse, that he can relate to the suffering of everyday people to an extent that we have not seen before in the history of the American presidency. He's one of our most human, one of our most empathetic, one of our most grounded presidents. And so I appreciate him for that.
Yeah, I am so thrilled to have him, and people just look at me like I'm just insane when I talk about it. But I think this guy is we're lucky to have him, and his years and years of experience in the government have been great. Final question for you. Since you do represent one of the bluest districts in the nation, is it the bluest district in the nation? It's got to be in like the top 10, right? Top 5 even?
So the district's been redrawn. I once had the bluest district in America, but it's in the top 5. It's
Okay.
the Bronx may be the most Democratic county in America, and I represent most of the Bronx. So I'm proud to represent one of the hotbeds of or strongholds of Democratic strength.
Yeah, I think it's great. And so my question for you is like, what lessons should the Democratic Party learn from your district and what's going on there and why it's so blue?
Look, I think look, the Bronx is so democratic that it's the air we breathe. Finding a Republican is like finding a unicorn. Good luck. But I think we in the Bronx have a sense that there's only one party that's fighting for us, that's fighting for the social contract, that's fighting to ensure that America works for all of us. And that party is the Democratic Party, that it's far from perfect, but there's one party that's committed to defending the social contract, and there's the other party which is committed to dismantling it. And we should be on the side of defending it, because that's what makes America the greatest country on earth.
Right on. Well, Congressman Ritchie Torres, I really appreciate you coming on here and chatting with me. What's the best way people can follow you if they want to stay on top of what you're working on in Congress? Do you prefer Twitter, Instagram?
You can follow me on Twitter, on Instagram. You can go to my website. But I welcome people following me and asking me questions and providing feedback.
Awesome. Again, thanks for your time. We are rooting for you and all the Democrats in the 118th Congress, and I'm really looking forward to you guys taking over. I think you're going to win, in my opinion, in January, and to see what you guys do with the 119th Congress. So thanks again for your time.
So take care.